We're going to be starting a meticulous examination of the source materials around one of the most defining and, frankly, heart-wrenching missing person cases in modern American history. We're talking about the disappearance of Etan Patz. It's a story that has spanned 4 decades now. It's involved this complex pursuit of 2 major suspects, endless legal battles, and it created a cultural footprint that, we are still walking on today.
It's absolutely essential that we ground this discussion in the profound tragedy at its core. Etan Khalil Patz, born October 9, 1972, vanished on May 25, 1979. He was only 6 years old, and he disappeared from the Soho neighborhood in Lower Manhattan. When you review the facts of this case, you realize it did so much more than just capture headlines. I mean, the legal and social fallout is widely credited with really catalyzing the entire modern missing children movement. It fundamentally shifted national legislation and how communities track and search for missing kids.
And that's the key context. We're not just chronicling a sad event here. We're analyzing a real flashpoint in American social history. So our analysis today is going to trace this incredible circuitous story. We'll start with that pivotal morning of the disappearance, analyze the 2 central figures accused, Jose Ramos and Pedro Hernandez, and we'll really try to dissect the complex, shifting legal outcomes, including the stunning and very recent 2025 conviction reversal. And finally, we'll look at the profound and lasting social legacy this single tragedy created for parents and for children really across the globe. So let's begin with that specific day in 1979.
May 25, 1979 really does feel like a date marking the end of one era of childhood and the beginning of another. Our sources highlight the context. Etan left his parents' apartment at 113 Prince Street in Soho. And this was significant because it was the first time Etan had been allowed to walk to his school bus stop alone.
And that detail about his first solo walk, that is the critical cultural marker. Soho in 1979, you have to remember, it was still a transitional neighborhood. It hadn't yet become the, highly gentrified, tightly controlled environment it is today. There was a lingering trust, a sense of neighborhood autonomy that allowed for things like a 6-year-old walking 2 blocks unsupervised. His destination was the bus stop at West Broadway and Prince Street.
Right. And his parents, Stan and Julie Patz, they felt secure enough to grant him this small but very important first step toward independence. We know from the source material that Etan was easily identifiable that morning. He was wearing a black Future Flight Captain pilot cap, a blue corduroy jacket, blue jeans, and blue sneakers with fluorescent stripes.
And there's this small humanizing detail that really stuck out to me from a 2009 book mentioned in our sources. He had $1. Just $1. He intended to stop and buy a soda for lunch. That simple plan, that tiny bit of independence, it was never completed. He never reached the bus stop, and he certainly never got on that bus.
And the initial breakdown in communication, it really reflects the outdated protocols of the time. The systems just weren't set up for an immediate reaction. Etan's teacher noticed he wasn't there, but for reasons that were never entirely clear, did not immediately report his absence to the school principal or to the administration.
So the alarm wasn't raised for hours. It was his mother, Julie Patz, who became concerned when Etan failed to return home after school at the usual time. She was the one who placed the call to the police. That short delay, those critical hours between the time he disappeared and the time the police were notified, well, that became a major point of analysis in the years that followed. It really drove the eventual adoption of nationwide protocols for schools to immediately notify parents when a child is absent without explanation.
Once the call was made, however, the response was incredibly robust for the time. An intense search was immediately launched that evening. It involved nearly 100 police officers, several bloodhounds, and a massive community mobilization. This intense initial effort, it continued for weeks, with absolutely no sign of the child.
A difficult but necessary part of any missing person investigation is the initial focus on the family. Detectives followed that painful protocol of initially considering the parents as suspects, but within a very short time, they concluded that Stan and Julie Patz had no involvement, and they turned their focus outward.
But the way this case was presented to the public was truly revolutionary. And it all ties back to the profession of Etan's father. Stanley Patz was a professional photographer. He had an extensive, high-quality archive of images of his son. And this immediately provided investigators with compelling, sharp, highly memorable images to use in the media campaign.
This is where it gets really interesting in terms of the cultural impact. Stan Patz's photos of Etan were immediately put to work. They weren't just some low-quality surveillance stills. They were expressive portraits that printed clearly. They were plastered onto countless missing child posters. They were projected onto screens in Times Square, instantly turning a local tragedy into a national high-visibility crisis.
That shift from a local story to a national consciousness event, you require that visual component. And then there's the most enduring visual legacy. Etan Patz became one of the very first children, if not the first widely recognized child, to be profiled on the famous photo on a milk carton, campaigns that really define the 1980s.
That campaign, the milk carton, is the embodiment of the cultural shift, isn't it? It forced the search for missing children out of just law enforcement databases and into every single American kitchen, every single day. This strategic use of high-quality media stand Patz's photographs, it turned public visibility itself into a crucial tool in the search process.
Exactly. It shifted the community responsibility. Before Etan Patz, people generally assumed that missing children were, runaways or victims of custody disputes, keeping the subject somewhat private. After Etan, the perception fundamentally changed. The child was now seen as a potential victim of abduction, and the burden of surveillance and reporting shifted from solely being a police function to being a whole of community responsibility. The image on the milk carton normalized the idea that every citizen was deputized, in a sense, to keep an eye out.
So despite that massive, pioneering public campaign, the initial search faded without success. The case became frustratingly cold, and the next major movement in the narrative, it didn't arrive until years later, when the focus shifted sharply toward a prime suspect.
That critical shift happened in 1985. The sources indicate that an assistant United States attorney, Stuart R. Grabois, took charge of the file, and he quickly zeroed in on Jose Antonio Ramos. Ramos was a figure already known to be a danger to children. He was a convicted child sexual abuser. And compounding this, he wasn't a total stranger to the Patz family's orbit. He was a friend of Etan's former babysitters.
So the profile immediately raises red flags, but there was evidence that concerned investigators years before Ramos was identified as the primary suspect. Can we go back to 1982? What specific evidence did they find then that implicated him, at least in general terms?
Certainly. In 1982, even before he was the official prime suspect, multiple boys had accused Ramos of trying to lure them into a secluded area, specifically a drain pipe near where he was living. When police followed up and searched that area, they found something deeply unsettling. Photographs of Ramos himself posing with various young boys who bore a distinct resemblance to Etan. This established a very concerning pattern of behavior in a proximity that just could not be ignored.
By 1990, Ramos was already incarcerated in Pennsylvania for an entirely unrelated molestation case, and this allowed prosecutors like Grabois to zero in on him.
It did. Grabois essentially doubled his efforts. He got deputized as a deputy state attorney general in Pennsylvania to prosecute that unrelated case, but primarily it was to keep questioning Ramos about Etan. The leverage worked to a degree.
And this is where Ramos made those statements that complicated the case for decades, because they were vague but also chillingly specific. When he was questioned in 1990, Ramos admitted that on the day Etan disappeared, he took a young boy back to his apartment to assault him. But he was very careful with his language.
He was. Ramos stated he was 90% sure that the boy he assaulted was the same child he later saw pictured on television, referencing Etan. But he never used Etan's name. And he attempted to mitigate the crime by claiming he put the boy on a subway going uptown afterward, implying the boy was left alive. This admission of contact and assault, tied directly to the date of the disappearance, provided powerful circumstantial weight.
And the circumstantial net tightened even further the following year.
Yes, in 1991, while Ramos was still serving time, a critical jailhouse informant came forward. This informant claimed that Ramos had confided in him. He indicated that he knew what happened to Etan. Even more persuasive, the informant drew investigators a map of Etan's school bus route, and it accurately identified Etan's bus stop as the third one on the route. This was a knowledge an outsider would not necessarily possess, suggesting intimate knowledge of the area and Etan's routine.
So Ramos was connected to the family. He had a documented history of predation. He confessed to assaulting a boy who looked like Etan on that exact day, and he seemed to have specific knowledge of Etan's routine. Why, then, were authorities unable to criminally prosecute him in the early 1980s or 90s?
Well, that goes back to the core difference between criminal and civil law, which is crucial for you to understand here. In criminal law, the burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. And without a body, without a weapon, without DNA, or reliable eyewitness testimony to link Ramos directly to the act of killing Etan, it was almost impossible to meet that extremely high standard. Ramos denied the murder, and his story that he put the boy on a subway could not be disproven without evidence of death.
That legal impasse must have been agonizing for the Patz family, so they changed their strategy. Etan was declared legally dead in absentia on June 19, 2001, a necessary step. Following this, the Patzes filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Ramos in New York civil court.
They absolutely pursued the civil route. The burden of proof in a civil case, preponderance of the evidence, is much lower than in a criminal case. It just means, is it more likely than not that Ramos caused Etan's death?
And Ramos refused to cooperate with the civil proceedings. He refused to answer questions under oath.
And that refusal was a fatal error for him legally. In 2004, the court entered a default judgment in favor of the Patzes. Because Ramos refused to participate, the court found him liable by default for the wrongful death of Etan Patz, and they awarded the family $2 million in damages.
It was a moral victory, but largely a symbolic one. They were never able to collect the funds. But this civil finding of liability, even if it was just symbolic, it provided the Patzes with a measure of legal truth after decades of uncertainty.
And it led to that incredibly potent, heartbreaking ritual that Stan Patz performed for years. Our sources describe how every year, on Etan's birthday and on the anniversary of his disappearance, Stan Patz would mail Ramos a copy of his son's missing child poster. On the back, he had the same typed message, "What did you do to my little boy?" This relentless annual act, it just speaks volumes about a father's dedication to forcing acknowledgement of the truth, even if it was only acknowledged in a prison cell.
That sustained emotional warfare lasted over a decade. But this entire narrative regarding Ramos, it came to a stunning and crucial turn of events later. The Patzes dismissed their own legal victory in 2016. They had the 2004 judgment against Ramos dismissed.
Yes, they formally walked away from the only legal finding of responsibility they had. This happened following the 2015 trial, the first trial of the second suspect, Pedro Hernandez.
That's a major gamble. I mean, they were dismissing a legal certainty for what was, at that moment, still a mistrial. What was it about the evidence concerning Pedro Hernandez that was so overwhelmingly persuasive that it convinced the Patz family, the ultimate arbiters of truth in this personal tragedy, that Ramos was not the killer?
It really speaks to the power of a specific, detailed voluntary confession, even if it lacked physical evidence. The decades of circumstantial evidence against Ramos, while strong, it always left a gap. The location of the body, the mechanism of death, the evidence against Hernandez, which we'll get into, seemed to fill that final hole. It provided a narrative of actual contact and death that the family found more definitive, enough to drop the civil finding against Ramos. It's an insight into how the human need for certainty can override years of documented circumstantial evidence.
The focus now shifts dramatically forward in time, 2 years shy of the case's 31st anniversary. The case had been dormant, legally speaking, for several years after the Ramos civil suit concluded.
The case was officially resurrected on May 25, 2010. Manhattan DA Cyrus Vance Jr. officially reopened the investigation. It symbolized a commitment to resolve the case using modern forensic techniques and fresh investigative eyes, really moving away from the Ramos dead end.
And this renewed commitment quickly led to a very public and intense investigation in the spring of 2012.
Yes. In April 2012, investigators from the FBI and NYPD concentrated their efforts on a specific structure, the Soho basement of 127B Prince Street, which was very close to the Patz family home. At the time of the disappearance, this basement space had been used by handyman, and crucially, the sources note it had been refurbished shortly after 1979.
The hope was astronomical.
No.
The police and media spent 4 days excavating and searching the concrete, but the search ended in disappointment.
After days of intense excavation, they announced nothing conclusive found. There were no remains, no DNA, no physical evidence that could definitively tie the location or the handyman to the crime. It was another frustrating dead end, adding to the decades of police effort.
But in a truly unexpected twist that followed just weeks after that basement search, the investigative team got the break they needed. A human lead, not a forensic one. On May 24, 2012, New York Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly announced that a man had been taken into custody who had implicated himself in Etan's disappearance.
That man was 51-year-old Pedro Hernandez. He was living in Maple Shade, New Jersey, but investigators had tracked him because of previous statements he had made. In 1979, when Etan vanished, Hernandez was just 18 years old and working as a convenience store clerk in a neighborhood bodega on Prince Street, the same block Etan lived on.
Which meant he was local, accessible, and in the right place at the right time. The specifics of his confession to police were immediate and horrifying, and they contradicted Ramos's story that the boy was put on the subway.
Hernandez confessed to luring Etan into the bodega, strangling him, and then disposing of his body. In his written confession to police, he specifically wrote, "I'm sorry I shook a second." He claimed he later put Etan's remains into the garbage, and he believed they were picked up and taken away.
And here is the central legal challenge that defined the next decade of trials. Despite this immediate and seemingly voluntary confession, the police had no physical evidence whatsoever to corroborate it. No body, no crime scene evidence, nothing. Hernandez was charged with second-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping based almost entirely on his own statements, which made the prosecution's case fundamentally tenuous.
The prosecution understood the gravity of relying solely on a confession, especially since coerced or false confessions are a documented risk in the judicial system. So they desperately needed external factors to support the confession's authenticity.
And those corroborating witnesses came through, providing a key pillar of the prosecution's argument.
Yes. 3 individuals specifically became vital. First, Jose Lopez, who was Hernandez's brother-in-law in New Jersey. He contacted investigators, convinced that his relative was responsible. The sources note that this connection provided an initial pathway for investigators to focus on Hernandez.
And the second set of witnesses spoke to something even older, a secret confession.
Precisely. Hernandez's own sister, Nina Hernandez, testified that it was an open family secret that he had confessed in the church. This was a reference to an event decades earlier. Furthermore, Tomas Rivera, who was the leader of a charismatic Christianity group at a church in Camden, New Jersey, where Hernandez had been a parishioner in the early 1980s, he corroborated the story. Rivera confirmed that Hernandez may have publicly confessed to the murder in the presence of fellow parishioners as part of a religious rite or moment of spiritual distress.
So the prosecution could argue this confession wasn't coerced by the NYPD in 2012. He was confessing to family members and church leaders 30 years ago. This external, decades-old knowledge became the mechanism the prosecution used to overcome the massive gap left by the lack of physical evidence.
It was a very powerful narrative strategy. But the defense team immediately attacked the reliability of the 2012 confession. They argued that it was false, coerced, or just fundamentally unreliable given the intense environment of police questioning and the suspect's mental state.
And the defense focused heavily on Hernandez's competency and mental health. This is where the specific medical diagnoses become crucial to the legal debate.
They argued that the confession was made after nearly 7 hours of intense police questioning. The defense cited 2 major factors. First, Hernandez was diagnosed with schizotypal personality disorder. This is a condition on the schizophrenia spectrum that can cause distortions in thinking and perception, making individuals potentially vulnerable to suggestion under stress. Second, and critically, his lawyers pointed out that he had an extremely low intelligence quotient. His IQ was measured around 70, placing him at the border of intellectual disability.
This low IQ and mental health condition were central to the argument that he simply wasn't capable of withstanding police pressure, nor could he fully comprehend the legal implications of waiving his rights.
This brought the entire proceeding to a massive pretrial hearing in 2014, and it is vital to understand the difference between the legal issue and the factual issue here. The purpose of this hearing was not for the judge to determine if Hernandez was telling the truth. That was reserved for the jury.
The purpose was purely legal admissibility. Did the judge find the evidence admissible?
Exactly. The judge had to determine whether the police followed the letter of the law. Specifically, did Hernandez feel free to leave during the initial questioning phase, before his rights were read? And, once he was formally Mirandized, told of his rights to remain silent and seek counsel, did he possess the necessary cognitive capacity, given his low IQ, to understand those rights and thus competently waive them? If the judge found that the police had overstepped or that he couldn't understand his rights, the confession would have been thrown out and the case would have collapsed.
The court ultimately ruled that the evidence, including the confession, was legally sufficient to support the charges, which meant the confession was admissible and the case could proceed to trial.
And this leads directly to the first trial, which began in January 2015. The prosecution presented the confession, the corroborating testimony about the family secret, and psychological testimony arguing that Hernandez was competent enough to stand trial and confess.
But the defense presented the counter-argument about cognitive impairment and coercion. That first trial, it lasted several months, and it resulted in a complex and frustrating outcome: a mistrial.
The jury was hung, deadlocked 11 for conviction and 1 against. This number tells a very specific story. The vast majority of the jury was clearly convinced by the confession and the corroborating testimony from the family and the church. But that single holdout juror likely focused exclusively on the defense's core argument, the reliability of a confession from a defendant with a very low IQ who was questioned for many hours without legal counsel. That one doubt was enough to prevent a verdict in May 2015.
A hung jury is not closure, so the DA immediately prepared for a retrial, which commenced on October 19th, 2016.
The second trial was effectively a repeat, but this time the prosecution really hammered home the decades-old nature of the confession, the idea that he had been confessing to this crime since the early 1980s, long before the NYPD arrived at his door in 2012.
And this attempt led to a resolution. On February 14, 2017, the jury found Pedro Hernandez guilty of kidnapping and felony murder. This verdict, achieved without a single piece of physical evidence linking him to the crime, relying solely on testimonial evidence and the confession, was a landmark moment for the Patz family, 38 years in the making.
The sentencing came 2 months later, in April 2017. Hernandez received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The conviction was subsequently affirmed by the appellate court in March 2020. For a few short years, it truly appeared that this legal labyrinth had ended.
But now we come to the sources that bring us right up to the present day, revealing that the story is far from over. It's a reminder that in the American legal system, a conviction is not always the final word.
On July 21, 2025, a federal appeals panel overturned the conviction. This was a massive reversal that sent shockwaves through the New York legal system, and it was entirely procedural.
This procedural error cited by the panel is key. They ruled that the state trial court's instructions to the jury were erroneous, specifically concerning the issue of Hernandez's cognitive impairment.
Yes. The panel argued that given Hernandez's documented low IQ, the trial court failed to provide specific, necessary instructions to the jury regarding how they should weigh the reliability of a confession from a defendant diagnosed with borderline intellectual disability. In essence, the jury instructions minimized or failed to adequately contextualize the mental challenges inherent to the defendant's condition, which means the legal process was faulty. The ruling stated that because of this error, Hernandez was entitled to a new trial or release from prison.
So after 4 decades, a civil suit, 2 criminal trials, and a life sentence, the case is back to square one. It's raising the same foundational questions about the reliability of the confession versus the absence of physical evidence.
The tension is palpable. The state has been searching for certainty, but the federal appeals process demands procedural perfection, especially when you're dealing with vulnerable defendants.
And the very latest development confirms that the saga will continue. Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg faced a deadline to decide whether to appeal the federal ruling or retry Hernandez. On November 25, 2025, he agreed to retry Hernandez, with the third trial mandated to begin by June 1st, 2026. This case, born in 1979, will be actively litigated deep into the 2020s. As fascinating and complex as the legal maneuvers are, the most profound aspect of the Etan Patz tragedy is its enduring influence on American culture and policy. It truly changed how we raise our children.
The formal recognition of this case's monumental impact began relatively quickly. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan officially designated May 25th, the anniversary of Etan's disappearance, as National Missing Children's Day in the United States. This formalized the connection between Etan's case and national policy, providing a permanent focus on the issue.
That focus grew globally. By 2001, the observance had spread worldwide. The International Center for Missing and Exploited Children coordinates the Help Bring Them Home campaign in conjunction with International Missing Children's Day in 22 countries. It's hard to find another single missing person case that became such a unifying global touchstone for a specific cause.
And the extensive, relentless media attention the case attracted is directly credited with significantly increasing public awareness of child abduction as a serious, generalized threat. Before 1979, cases of missing children rarely garnered national prominence unless they involved wealthy or famous families. After Etan Patz, every missing child became a national concern, in part because of the successful deployment of his image in the media.
The resulting behavioral changes were immediate and lasting, radically altering childhood norms. Our sources note the most immediate consequence was the death of the free-range kid era. Parents, especially in urban environments, became increasingly unwilling to allow their children to walk to school unsupervised, even in seemingly safe neighborhoods. The collective feeling of safety eroded sharply.
And it wasn't just physical movement that changed. The philosophical approach to parenting and safety shifted entirely. The Patz case promoted the concept of stranger danger.
We hear that phrase all the time now, but what did it mean in the context of the 1980s, and what were the consequences of its widespread adoption?
Stranger danger instilled the idea that all adults who are not known to the child must be regarded as potential sources of danger. This message, while well-intentioned and born from a genuine fear of abduction, it profoundly altered community dynamics. Before, neighbors or random adults might have been trusted resources, someone to ask for help or direction. After Eaton, the default setting shifted to suspicion.
That shift from generalized trust to generalized suspicion was a direct cultural fallout of the case. And while the campaign was designed to protect children, critics later pointed out that it often instilled excessive fear and may have focused attention on the wrong type of threat.
Exactly. The focus on the stranger often masked the reality that the vast majority of child abusers and abductors are known to the victim or their family. The pervasive fear of the random predatory stranger, fueled by cases like Etan Patz, created an atmosphere of anxiety that sometimes overlooked dangers closer to home while also reducing the organic supportive bonds between community members. It changed the very dynamic of public space for children.
Reviewing this 4-decade saga, you see a case defined by absence. The absence of a body, the absence of physical evidence, and the absence of final legal certainty. It's a legal quest spanning nearly 50 years, pursuing 2 suspects, relying on a confession fiercely debated for its psychological context, and culminating in a conviction that was then legally reversed. The central tragedy remains the ultimate uncertainty faced by the Patz family.
This source material provides a stark illustration of how one horrific, unsolved event can become the legislative and cultural driver for an entire nation, fundamentally reshaping public safety policies and parenting philosophies for generations. Despite the legal system's relentless search for factual truth and prosecutorial closure, the ultimate painful question mark over Etan Patz's fate remains for his family. This compels us to ask an important question that extends beyond the courtroom. In a world driven by the legal system's necessity for concrete facts and evidentiary certainty, how do we, as a society and as individuals, achieve emotional peace when the truth remains elusive?
Thanks for listening.